Now, time to answer some of your questions on what exactly will happen in Parliament this week and how MPs will deal with issues over the coming days. With me, Maddy Thimont, a researcher at the Institute for Government, and Peter Barnes, our political analyst. I'm going to go straight on. Welcome to you both. Thank you for joining us. I'm going to crack on because we got this one, first of all, from Fabian Elster. Why is it OK to put the same deal to the vote multiple times in the Commons, but a second referendum is seen as undermining democracy? Maddy.
I think, firstly, the sort of phrase undermining democracy, that's obviously a political judgment. Not everyone thinks that is the case. But, I mean, the thing is that we elect MPs to make decisions on behalf of us. MPs have recently had a chance to vote on whether there should be a second referendum, and they decided not to at this stage. I think people do think there is going to be another opportunity in the Commons to vote on whether or not to hold a referendum. So I think that question hasn't necessarily been sort of finalised at this point.
I think, but it's the principle of the thing, and you can sense Fabian's anger at this, and it's something I've seen many times on Twitter in the recent weeks, that Theresa May has come back with essentially the same deal, and it was John Bercow who eventually said, you know what, you can't.
Well, I was going to say, I mean, the Speaker has actually said that actually you can't keep trying again, probably for that sort of fundamental reason, and he has said that they can't vote on the deal again until something has changed. So, you know, it's sort of tricky. It's sort of parliamentary procedure versus a sort of wider question about how people should be engaging with politics in this country.
Anything?
Yeah, I fully agree with that. I mean, it could be argued that the situation with another referendum is a bit like the situation with another vote in the House of Commons. The Speaker says there's got to be some change in circumstance, or the offer has got to be a bit different. Now, you could argue the same with a referendum. You know, if we had exactly the same referendum and had it been quite soon after the first one, sure, that would have looked pretty suspect. But after a long period of time, or if it's a different referendum question, it could be argued that that would be democratically acceptable.
OK, next question from Ronnie in Glasgow. What legal right do our MPs have to fail to carry out the result of the referendum result? Can we still leave on Friday, he says. I voted Remain, but can't believe our Parliament is acting in such a dictatorial way. We appear now to be no longer a democracy. Anger there again. People are very vexated about this one.
The first thing to say is that the original referendum we had in 2016 was an advisory referendum, so it didn't impose any strict legal duty on MPs to carry out what the result of the referendum said. Now, the government and other MPs had said, we will follow your wishes, we will carry out the result of the referendum. So there's a kind of moral duty to carry on with what the referendum said, but there's no legal force that the House of Commons has to implement the referendum result. The
leaving on Friday, I mean, it's still, isn't it the legal default?
No, so actually in international law we no longer are leaving on Friday. So the UK and the EU have agreed to extend that Article 50 negotiating period until the 12th of April.
Do you mean EU law or?
Yes, so it's an international agreement that has been reached between Theresa May, the government here, and the EU. But there is a question about what's going on in UK law, and we do need to change the date of exit in UK law to ensure it reflects the sort of our exit in international law, to make sure that our sort of domestic statute book continues to make sense of that period.
And sorry, just to say, we're expecting MPs to vote tomorrow on whether to change the definition of exit day in UK law to match the new date agreed in international law.
It's going to be a busy day here tomorrow, isn't it? Yeah. All right, Reese on Twitter. What happens if the indicative votes tomorrow don't produce a clear majority and the Prime Minister fails to get her deal through a third time? Does it make a referendum or an election inevitable?
I mean, it's a good question. I think, sort of, in terms of what we know will happen, if the MPs do not approve a withdrawal agreement by the end of this week, then we know that we've got an extension of Article 50 to the 12th of April, but then the government is going to have to decide what it does. And it seems like it'll be more likely at that stage, to avoid no deal on the 12th of April, that they will request a longer extension. And then I think, coming to the sort of the content of the question, then the big question is, what are they going to do with the long extension? And that's when I expect that MPs in the House are going to have some very strong views about whether a general election or a second referendum might be the way to actually try and resolve this issue.
Doesn't actually sort this issue out, though, does it?
No, and that's the question, is if you have a general election, will that be based on different Brexit proposals that each party might set out, or are you really asking a more fundamental question about Brexit?
And it's worth adding that it's quite likely the indicative votes won't come out with a single clear answer, at least tomorrow. We're actually expecting it to be more than a one-day process. It's quite likely we'll have some indicative votes tomorrow, but then
do you know what the process is? Can you explain?
We don't know for sure. We're expecting Sir Oliver Letwin to table his Business in the House motion later this afternoon, in fact, in a few minutes' time, which is going to set out how he thinks it ought to work. But I think the expectation is that tomorrow MPs will get to vote on a range of different options. They'll probably be given a piece of paper and they'll be able to tick aye or no to each of the options in turn. So they'll be able to vote on several different, and they could say yes to lots of them, or they could say no to all of them if they want. And then we'll get the results of each of those option votes at the end of the day, so we'll have an idea of which ones have more support than the others, and then perhaps next week it will be whittled down to a smaller number of options, and there might be a different voting system to try and come up with one agreed plan. But we don't know the full details.
Is that on the basis that if you said no to something tomorrow, if your preferred choice goes, you can then come back to that one? Or?
Well, possibly, but it's possible that more than one gets a majority tomorrow. And then it may be a case of saying, well, which ones are the most popular? Or it may be that none of them do, but some of them are a bit closer to a majority than others, so...
And I think it's just to add, I mean, the way that we hold these votes will sort of... Depending on which process you go for, then you might be more likely to lead to a sort of majority outcome. So, for example, you could do a system where you vote against sort of all, say there are 5 options, all 5 at once, and then you eliminate the one that's got the least votes. And then you go through and vote for the next 4, and then you eliminate the one with the least votes. And sort of try and get to a point where we do have one option remaining. I mean, that's one example. We don't know what they're going to do, but that would be one way to try and find one option left standing.
With John Bercow acting as host of Eurovision or however, whatever.
Yes, you know, Strictly Come Brexit, I think a colleague of mine has referred to it as. So, yeah, I mean, I guess we'll sort of see what happens.
Yeah. We are all going slightly mad, aren't we? Right. This one from Andy. I was a soft leaver and still am. Contrary to what the no dealers say, not all Brexit voters want to leave the single market. So I hope Parliament compromises on a Norway-type arrangement, but could they really force the Prime Minister to enact it? I mean, many will be arguing that tomorrow, I guess.
Yeah, so I mean, at the moment, indicative votes are just that. They'll be indicative of the will of the House. They'll not be legally binding on the Prime Minister. And the Prime Minister did say yesterday that she would not seek to negotiate something that was not sort of reflected in the 2017 Conservative election manifesto. I mean, there has been some talk about MPs trying to take control of parliamentary time once again to actually pass legislation which would compel the Prime Minister to sort of adopt, or the government to adopt a negotiating position, and that's sort of one way they could try and do it, and we might see a bit more talk of that coming up.
Peter, a lot of talk of Norway plus or what was the 2.0 or
Customs Union 2.0,
whatever arrangement it is, but what at the moment we're hearing from Theresa May is whatever they decide here tomorrow, well, she might just say, well, I don't care.
Well, ultimately, it will be the government, if MPs vote for a different type of deal, ultimately it's going to have to be the government that goes to negotiate the deal. And it's going to be a long, complicated process. So it is quite hard to see, even if MPs pass this law, as Maddy says, where they say you've got to go and negotiate a customs union, they can't micromanage what government ministers are doing every 5 minutes. And it's going to be members of the government who are going to Brussels to negotiate with EU officials. And so it's quite hard to see how they can completely control how the negotiation is going to go ahead.
Right. Next question. This is from Anas Shamjad on Twitter. What are the chances of revoking Article 50?
Well, I guess...
I should preface this by mentioning the petition, which has more than 5.5 million signatures to it. So, and I'll leave that there. But what are the chances of being revoked?
Yeah, I mean, so in terms of the petition, if a petition gets over 100,000 signatures, it has to be debated in the House of Commons. So we can expect there will be a debate at some point on whether to revoke. I mean, the thing about it is that it firstly depends on, is there a majority in Parliament for revoking. Parliament can't actually compel the government to revoke Article 50. This is a choice, and it's worth saying as well, this is something that the UK can choose to do on its own. It doesn't need agreement with the EU, which is quite important. But at the moment, it doesn't seem like the government wants to go down that option, and it's very challenging for, as I say, MPs to actually compel them to do something like that.
Yeah, I mean, we should just say that revoking Article 50 means cancelling Brexit once and for all, right? Yeah. I mean, just to explain the jargon.
And well, it means us staying on the very terms we're on right now with the EU.
It just means carrying on as a member of the EU as we have done. I would have said a few weeks ago that there was practically zero chance. I still think it's a very low chance, but you have to say it has gone up a little bit, partly because of the petition, partly because Parliament has said they don't want no deal, they don't want Theresa May's deal twice. If they cannot agree on anything else, you can imagine getting to some circumstance. I still think a long shot.
OK, a couple of quick ones. This from PG in Wales. Can the EU now say they will not let us leave?
No, they can't.
Yeah, I totally agree with that, yeah.
Good. Bernice on Twitter says, if we leave with the Prime Minister's withdrawal agreement, can we go back in on our current terms if we change our minds while still in the withdrawal period?
I think we would have to negotiate that. If we revoked Article 50 just to stay in the EU, the rules are quite clear, or the offer is quite clear, we'd just be able to stay on the current terms. If we formally leave, we stop being a member of the EU, even if we're still in the transition period, and then the UK for some reason decided to change its mind, it's not really clear we have any legal right to go back in under exactly the same terms. So it would be a matter for negotiation.
Well, I'm sorry, I laugh, but just looking at Donald Tusk, Michel Barnier, you don't get the sense that they would necessarily be thrilled at the prospect of having more negotiations.
Well, that's absolutely true. It would be up to the EU to agree to us rejoining at all. They could just simply say no.
Right.
And even if they said yes, they could impose different conditions.
One last question, Maddy. Someone called Disillusioned with Politics on Twitter. Just the one. If we decided to revoke Article 50, would the EU impose any penalties on the UK due to time wasted? I mean, it's been 2 years of hard work.
I mean, it's an interesting question. Again, sort of as Peter said, if we revoke Article 50, then we should technically be in the EU on current terms, but it might be something that the EU would like to impose conditions on, and again, that probably would be subject to negotiation.
Yeah?
Yeah, I have nothing else to add to that. That's a very good answer. Yeah.
Excellent. Well, Maddy and Peter, thank you both very much for joining us on BBC Ask This. Thank you.
Thank you.